20-year-old Matthew Boyd had been enjoying a night out with friends. He was fit, popular, serving in the British Army, and had his whole life ahead of him. Now he was unconscious, suffering from catastrophic injuries, and what police would later discover via CCTV would leave little doubt that this was no accident. The footage showed a brutal confrontation lasting less than a minute. A confrontation so violent that prosecutors would later describe one man's arm as moving like a piston as blow after blow rained down. But perhaps most shocking of all was what the attacker said afterwards. "It wasn't even a beating," he said. "It was shortly after midnight on the 8th of May 2016 when Lewis Davis was walking home from work in Briamtown, Enter. As he made his usual way along Lion Street opposite Greg's Bakery, he noticed something unusual in front of him. At first, in the darkness, he couldn't work out exactly what he was looking at. But as he got closer, he realized it was a man. The man was lying face down in the road. His feet were on the pavement, and his body was partially in the street. Lewis called out to him, but there was no response. He moved closer and tapped him on the shoulder, but still nothing. Realizing that something was seriously wrong, he called an ambulance. A police officer arrived moments later and immediately began administering first aid. But despite his efforts, he was unable to find a pulse. And searching the man's pockets for ID, he found a British Army identity card. And the casualty was identified as 20-year-old Private Matthew Boyd. Paramedics arrived at 1:13 a.m. and rushed Matthew to the nearby hospital. Doctors fought to save him, but at 2:40 a.m., tragically, Matthew Boyd was pronounced dead. A post-mortem examination would later reveal he had suffered fatal blunt force injuries. The obvious question was simple. How had a healthy 20-year-old soldier ended up beaten to death on a street in Breen? The answer would lead police to CCTV footage, a local amateur boxer, and a night of escalating aggression that ended in violent tragedy. But before we get to that, who exactly was Matthew Boyd? Because to understand the scale of what was lost that night, we first need to understand this young man at the center of the story. Matthew was originally from Carrickfergus in Northern Ireland. When he was 7 years old, his family moved to Gibraltar, where he spent his childhood growing up alongside his mom, his dad, his brothers, and his sister. Friends and family all described him as funny, loyal, full of life, the type of person who could walk into a room and instantly lift everyone's mood. At just 16 years old, he joined the Royal Gibraltar Regiment. He embraced military life and quickly became a respected member of the regiment despite his young age. And during his service, he completed tours in Northern Ireland and took part in numerous military exercises. In May 2016, he traveled to Breen after volunteering for a training exercise at the Infantry Battle School. This opportunity had only come up because additional recruits were needed, and Matthew had stepped forward alongside a friend. For him, it was just another opportunity to further his military career. No one could ever have imagined it would be his final week alive. On the evening of 7th of May, what began as a routine night out would ultimately end in murder. Because while Matthew Boyd was enjoying a night out with fellow soldiers, another group of men were drinking their way through Breentown Center. One of them was 24-year-old Jake Valerie. Later during his murder trial, witness after witness would describe the same thing: aggressive, confrontational. That evening, he was looking for trouble. To most people, Valerie appeared to have a lot going for him. He worked locally as a picture framer. He was very physically fit and was regarded as one of the best amateur middleweight boxers in Wales. His boxing coach would later describe him as one of the top 10 amateurs in the country in his weight division. And outside the ring, he played football for Breentown Football Club. One of his teammates was 23-year-old Aaron Evans. And on Saturday, the 7th of May, the pair had spent the afternoon playing football before heading into town with teammates like a normal post-match evening. But as the hours passed and the alcohol flowed, Valerie's behavior began attracting attention. Witnesses later described him becoming increasingly loud, argumentative, and unpredictable. At one pub, he approached a group of hill walkers, making them feel uncomfortable with what they described as intrusive behavior. At another, he became involved in an angry confrontation with a woman drinking there. Witnesses said he lunged aggressively towards her, and the argument continued later elsewhere in town. He was later thrown out of that pub and another one, Harley's Bar. Valerie reportedly became angry after buying drinks for friends and not receiving one in return. He was thrown out again, this time after he ripped up a cocktail menu with his teeth. Bouncers there described him as loud and Larry. By now, several people had encountered Jake Valerie that evening, and many of them had reached the same conclusion that he was spoiling for a fight. And according to evidence later heard in court, just an hour before Matthew Boyd's death, Valerie was overheard boasting that he was the hardest man in Breen. I know, right? Sometime after midnight, Valerie Evans and others arrived at the cell bar. It was here that their paths crossed with Matthew Boyd, and exactly what happened next remains disputed. But what isn't disputed is what happened afterwards, because CCTV cameras captured the aftermath, and this was ultimately helped convict Jake Valerie of murder. Outside the bar, there was some form of disagreement between Matthew, Vonnie, and Evans. Later, Valerie claimed a bottle had been smashed by Matthew. Evans disputed that account. Neither man's version fully matched the evidence, but what investigators were able to establish for sure was that Matthew eventually walked away and the confrontation should have ended right there. But instead, it escalated. According to the trial judge, Matthew attempted to leave the situation behind, but Valerie chose to follow him, and then he chased him. And what happened next lasted less than a minute, but it would cost Matthew Boyd his life. The CCTV showed Valerie catch up with the young soldier. A struggle followed, and then came the violence. Matthew was punched to the ground, but it didn't stop there. Prosecutors later told the jury that Valerie's arm moved like a piston as he repeatedly struck Matthew. Blow after blow landed, which would be described as sustained and savage. And eventually, Matthew stopped moving. The attack was over, and Valerie finally walked away. For Matthew Boyd, however, the consequences were only just beginning as Matthew lay critically injured in the gutter. Valerie just returned to the cell bar for another drink. He was worried, though, and later he and Evans came back looking for the man. But Matthew was no longer where they'd left him, and Valerie would later claim he assumed the soldier had got up and gone home. But as news began spreading through town that emergency services were dealing with a serious incident, his confidence in his swagger began to evaporate. The text messages he sent over the next few hours would later become important evidence. But the little fight we had surely couldn't warrant that. The only thing I can think of is he's fallen and hit his head. It wasn't even a beating. As dawn approached after watching boxing from the U.S., Valerie and his friend walked back into town where they saw a police cordon surrounding Lion Street. The reality of the situation was now beginning to sink in. One text he sent at the time read, "We are going down for that if it's that bad." Another asked whether he should hand himself in or wait for the police to find him. The following morning, Valerie contacted his boxing coach, who was also a serving police officer. When Valerie explained what had happened, the coach immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. He instructed him to shut the shop where he was working and report to the police immediately. And shortly afterwards, Valerie was arrested. What followed was a murder investigation that would expose the full horror of just what happened on Lion Street and leave a grieving family searching for answers. And when the case eventually reached court, prosecutors would argue that Matthew Boyd was an entirely innocent victim who had simply crossed paths with the wrong man at the wrong time. For the Boyd family, it would be a time when they had to sit and hear and see every detail of Matthew's final moments laid out before a jury. The prosecution case was straightforward, and that was that Matthew Boyd had done nothing to deserve what happened to him. The QC told jurors that shortly after midnight, Matthew had been chased down Line Street and subjected to a sustained and brutal attack. He said a little after midnight, Matthew Boyd was punched. He went to the ground and then he was beaten until he moved no more. He completely overpowered that man. It was sustained, repeated, and unlawful violence delivered with intent to cause really serious harm. The prosecution argued that Valerie's aggression throughout the evening showed exactly the kind of mindset he was in when he encountered Matthew. Witnesses told how he'd spent much of the night arguing with strangers, causing disturbances in pubs, and, of course, boasting about being the hardest man in Breen, thrown out of 2 pubs as well. Matthew Boyd had simply become the latest target of a man looking for trouble. Meanwhile, his May Evans faced a charge of manslaughter. Prosecutors alleged he'd assisted his friend during the incident, but Evans denied any involvement. In fact, much of his evidence contradicted Valerie's account of events, as he told the jury that while there had been some form of disagreement between the men, he had not witnessed the violence that Valerie later described. He denied there had been any need for Valley to act as a peacemaker and disputed his friend's story. Then came Val's evidence. He admitted punching Matthew while he had no choice with the CCTV. He then admitted continuing to strike him whilst he was on the ground, but he did insist that he never intended to kill anyone. He claimed he'd seen Matthew get back on all fours afterwards and so believed he was okay. The problem for Valerie is that jurors had seen the harrowing CCTV, and CCTV, unlike witnesses, it doesn't lie. After listening to the evidence, the jury retired to consider their verdicts. Eventually, the jury returned and the courtroom fell silent. First came the verdict for Aaron Evans, not guilty. He was cleared of manslaughter and walked free from court. Then came the verdict for Jake Valerie, guilty of murder. The jury had rejected his version of events. Matthew Boyd's killer had been convicted, but for Matthew's family and friends, there was no sense of victory, only relief that justice had finally been done. After the verdict, they released a statement describing the man they had lost. They said, "Matthew was full of life. He was loving, caring, and loyal. He was always playing jokes on his peers and family and always brought smiles to our faces. He can make a joke from anything. He was witty and lighthearted." The words painted a picture that stood in stark contrast to the grim details the jury had been listening to. Matthew was, after all, a son, a brother, a friend, a young soldier who should have had his whole life ahead of him. At the sentencing hearing, the emotional impact of Matthew's death became painfully clear. His 10-year-old sister wrote a letter to her brother. Part of it read, "You are in heaven now, when no one can hurt you." And his devastated mom described how she cried herself to sleep and told the court that Valerie had destroyed an entire family. As those statements were read out, the court heard of the consequences of a violent attack that lasted under a minute. Then it was Valerie's turn. His lawyers argued for leniency. They pointed that he was young. He had a lack of previous serious convictions. He had a young daughter, just 15 months, and they argued that he'd intended to cause serious injury and not death. The judge chose to sentence Valerie to life in prison with a minimum term of 16 years. A weak sentence, I think you will agree. Sounds very soft to me. He told Valerie, "Matthew Boyd was a young soldier in a new town, simply having an evening away from camp with his colleagues. You, however, were aggressive, confrontational, and threatening throughout the whole evening." The judge concluded that Matthew had attempted to walk away from the confrontation, but Valerie wouldn't let it go. He chased him down the street. He described the attack as sustained and savage, and he rejected any suggestion at all that Matthew had provoked what happened. "You chased him down and attacked him for no other reason than you wanted trouble. You showed no remorse then, and you have shown no remorse since. Your sole concern has been to minimize your actions and escape the consequences." For Matthew's family, of course, no sentence could ever truly compensate for what they had lost. A son who would never return home. A brother who would never grow old alongside his siblings. A life ended over a confrontation that should never have happened. And perhaps that's what makes this case so tragic. There was no long-running feud, no carefully planned attack, no history at all between the men. Just a chance encounter between a young soldier enjoying a night out and a man who has spent the whole evening looking for trouble.